Gotham has always treated identity as inheritance. Long before a new hero puts on a costume, the role already exists in the public imagination, shaped by memories, expectations, and myths created by those who came before. Batman is not merely a man. Robin is not merely a partner. Both function as symbols that occupy fixed territory within Gotham's culture, carrying assumptions about who belongs inside them and who does not. The costume may change hands, but the invisible rules surrounding it often remain untouched. For decades, the Robin mantle appeared remarkably stable. Different people wore the costume, but each successor seemed to fit comfortably within a structure that had already decided what Robin was supposed to be. Dick Grayson became the ideal. Jason Todd became the warning. Tim Drake became the restoration of order after disruption. Each inherited the role differently, yet all were ultimately absorbed into the mythology. The symbol bent around them without ever breaking. Stephanie Brown entered that world carrying a very different burden. Unlike her predecessors, she was never simply trying to live up to the expectations attached to Robin. She was trying to justify her presence inside a role that often seemed uncomfortable with her occupying it at all. Her challenge was not merely performance. It was legitimacy. The question surrounding her was never whether she could be Robin. The question was whether Gotham, Batman, and even the audience were willing to accept her as Robin. That distinction transforms the entire meaning of her story. Most legacy narratives are built around competence. A successor struggles, learns, fails, grows, and eventually proves worthy of the title they inherit. Stephanie's journey follows a far more unsettling path. Competence never fully resolves the conflict because competence is not the source of the conflict. The barrier exists somewhere deeper, hidden within assumptions that were established long before she arrived. What makes her story so psychologically fascinating is that exclusion rarely arrives in dramatic form. There is no single gatekeeper standing at the entrance. No single moment that explains everything. Instead, exclusion emerges through patterns, through hesitation, through doubt, through the constant sensation that acceptance remains conditional. The role is available, yet belonging never feels secure. The title is granted, yet legitimacy always appears vulnerable to removal. In that sense, Stephanie becomes trapped inside a paradox. She successfully achieves what she was striving for, only to discover that achievement does not produce the stability she expected. Becoming Robin does not eliminate uncertainty. It magnifies it. Every mistake becomes evidence. Every setback becomes confirmation of suspicions that were already waiting beneath the surface. The symbol that should provide certainty instead becomes a source of pressure. This pressure extends far beyond superhero fiction. Human beings build their identities through recognition as much as through accomplishment. We learn who we are partly through the way institutions, communities, and relationships respond to us. When recognition remains inconsistent, self-perception becomes unstable. Success begins to feel temporary. Belonging starts to feel borrowed. The individual remains inside the room, while quietly wondering whether everyone else expects them to leave. Few relationships illustrate this dynamic more clearly than Stephanie's connection to Tim Drake. On the surface, their story appears to be a romance between two young heroes navigating the same world. Beneath that surface lies a more complicated tension. Tim occupies a position of symbolic security within the Robin legacy. Stephanie occupies a position of symbolic uncertainty. He stands near the center of the structure. She repeatedly finds herself forced to argue for her place within it. As a result, Stephanie Brown's story gradually becomes about much more than heroism. It becomes a story about access to legitimacy, about what happens when someone enters a system that presents itself as open while quietly preserving older definitions of who truly belongs. Every attempt to move closer to the center encounters resistance. Every effort to claim ownership over the symbol reveals invisible boundaries surrounding it. This is why the story of Stephanie Brown continues to resonate long after specific storylines, editorial decisions, and continuity changes fade into the background. At its core, it confronts a deeply familiar experience. The experience of arriving somewhere that promises inclusion, only to discover that acceptance operates according to rules nobody openly acknowledges. The experience of carrying a title while never fully inheriting the security attached to it. The tragedy of Stephanie Brown is not that she failed to become Robin. She did become Robin. The tragedy is that becoming Robin never solved the problem she was actually confronting. The role granted her visibility, but not permanence. It granted her access, but not certainty. It placed her on the stage, yet left her fighting for a place in a performance that often seemed written for someone else. And that is the central question hidden beneath her entire history. Not what it means to fight crime beside Batman, but what it means to inherit a symbol that was never truly designed with you in mind. Because Stephanie Brown's story begins at the exact moment most legacy stories end. The moment after the dream has already been achieved, when the deeper struggle for belonging finally reveals itself. Before Stephanie Brown ever became Robin, she was already fighting a battle that most members of the Bat family never had to fight. Dick Grayson entered Batman's world as a tragedy in need of direction. Jason Todd entered as a problem in need of structure. Tim Drake entered as a solution to a crisis. Each arrived carrying a narrative that immediately justified their presence. Gotham understood why they were there. Batman understood why they were there. The audience understood why they were there. Their legitimacy was built into the foundation of their stories. Stephanie's origin emerged from a very different place. She was born from dysfunction rather than destiny. Her father was not a fallen hero, a murdered acrobat, or a promising successor. He was the clue master, a criminal whose failures defined him as much as his crimes. Stephanie's earliest relationship with heroism was therefore inseparable from embarrassment, disappointment, and inherited shame. Long before she put on a costume, she was already living inside the consequences of someone else's failures. This distinction matters because Gotham is a city obsessed with lineage. Characters are constantly measured against the people who came before them. Sons inherit fathers, partners inherit mentors, sidekicks inherit mantles. The city operates like a vast symbolic dynasty where identity is often determined by ancestry rather than individuality. Within such a system, Stephanie begins her journey carrying one of the least prestigious inheritances imaginable. She does not emerge from greatness. She emerges from failure. Her first identity, spoiler, reflects this reality. Even the name positions her differently from nearly every hero around her. It does not announce mastery, power, or authority. It describes interference, disruption, someone operating from the edges of a larger story rather than from its center. While Batman, Robin, and Nightwing function as symbols of institutional permanence, spoiler sounds temporary by design. The name itself suggests someone attempting to alter events from the outside. That outsider status becomes one of the defining forces of her character. Unlike many heroes who spend their early years trying to discover who they are, Stephanie spends much of her early history trying to convince others that she deserves to be taken seriously. Her struggle is not centered on identity formation alone. It is centered on recognition. The difference seems subtle, but it shapes every aspect of her development. Recognition functions differently from achievement. Achievement depends largely on action. Recognition depends on response. One can train harder, fight better, and make smarter decisions, but recognition remains partially controlled by other people. This creates a persistent vulnerability. Success feels unstable because acceptance can always be withdrawn. The individual becomes dependent on judgments that exist beyond their control. Batman himself unintentionally reinforces this dynamic. His relationship with sidekicks has always contained a contradiction. He He creates partnerships because he understands the value of connection, yet he evaluates those partnerships through standards so demanding that few people can ever fully satisfy them. Every Robin enters a world shaped by expectations that border on impossible. The role promises belonging while simultaneously placing belonging under constant examination. Dick Grayson survived this pressure because he eventually outgrew it. His story became one of independence. Jason Todd exploded against it. His story became one of rebellion. Tim Drake adapted to it. His story became one of compatibility. Stephanie encounters a different challenge altogether. She never receives enough stability within the system to develop a secure relationship with it in the first place. This becomes particularly important when examining her relationship with Tim Drake. On the surface, their connection appears straightforward. Two young vigilantes operating in the same environment develop affection for one another. Yet beneath the romance exists a powerful symbolic asymmetry. Tim occupies a position that Stephanie continually seeks but can never fully secure. He belongs to the legacy in a way that she does not. Tim Drake represents institutional confidence. He is perhaps the most deliberately chosen Robin in Batman's history. He earns the role through observation, intelligence, and persistence. More importantly, he is repeatedly validated by the narrative itself. Even when he struggles, his legitimacy remains largely unquestioned. Readers, characters, and creators generally agree that Tim belongs where he is. Stephanie experiences the opposite reality. Her competence is often evaluated through skepticism. Her mistakes carry disproportionate weight. Her victories rarely generate the same sense of permanence enjoyed by her peers. As a result, the relationship between Stephanie and Tim gradually acquires a symbolic dimension that extends beyond romance. Tim becomes a living reminder of the acceptance she struggles to obtain. The result is not simple jealousy or resentment. The dynamic is far more complicated than that. Stephanie genuinely loves Tim, yet his position within Gotham's hierarchy constantly reflects her own uncertainty back at her. Every relationship functions partly as a mirror. Through Tim, Stephanie is repeatedly confronted with the difference between belonging and aspiring to belong. She sees what stability looks like because she stands beside someone who possesses it. At the same time, Gotham itself amplifies these tensions. The city operates less like a community and more like a symbolic arena. Every character occupies a specific position within a carefully maintained hierarchy. Batman sits at the center. The Robins orbit around him. Allies and villains define themselves through proximity to this gravitational core. Movement within the system is possible, but the system rarely changes its underlying structure. This is why Stephanie's eventual transition into the Robin role carried such significance. On paper, it represented acceptance. The outsider had reached the center. The vigilante operating from the margins had inherited one of the most important symbols in Gotham. The story appeared poised to complete a familiar arc. Persistence had finally been rewarded. Yet the very speed with which that acceptance unraveled revealed a deeper truth. Stephanie's appointment exposed tensions that had existed beneath the surface all along. Her presence challenged assumptions that many readers, characters, and even creators may not have consciously recognized. Suddenly, the Robin mantle was occupied by someone who did not fit the inherited image attached to it. The symbol had changed more radically than the institution surrounding it was prepared to acknowledge. What emerged was not merely disagreement over a character. It was a conflict over the meaning of the role itself. Robin had always been presented as an evolving legacy, but Stephanie's tenure forced a confrontation with the limits of that evolution. The mantle claimed flexibility. The reaction to Stephanie revealed rigidity. The institution presented itself as inclusive. The response exposed boundaries. This is where her story becomes psychologically fascinating. Exclusion is often imagined as a closed gate, a clear denial, a visible barrier. Stephanie's experience demonstrates something far more complex. She is allowed inside. She receives the title. She occupies the position. Yet uncertainty continues to surround her presence. The gate opens, but acceptance remains incomplete. That incomplete acceptance becomes the emotional foundation upon which much of her later history is built. Every subsequent success carries traces of the earlier rejection. Every attempt to establish herself encounters memories of impermanence. The struggle gradually shifts from proving capability to protecting self-worth against instability. What began as a quest for legitimacy becomes a negotiation with doubt itself. And this is precisely where the central conflict of Stephanie Brown's story begins to emerge. The question is no longer whether she can perform the role. The question is what happens to a person's identity when belonging is repeatedly offered and withdrawn. What happens when recognition arrives only in temporary forms? What happens when acceptance becomes something that must be continuously defended rather than securely possessed? Because Gotham is full of heroes who fight criminals, Stephanie Brown became something rarer. A hero forced to fight for the right to remain visible inside the very legacy she had already inherited. The first fracture in Stephanie Brown's story emerges from a simple contradiction. Robin is traditionally presented as a role that must be earned, yet Stephanie discovers that earning it does not guarantee ownership of it. This transforms the meaning of every achievement that follows. Instead of functioning as evidence that she belongs, success becomes something she must constantly reproduce. The role ceases to feel like a destination and begins to resemble a trial with no final verdict. Most members of the Bat family operate within a framework of accumulated trust. Mistakes happen, conflicts emerge, and relationships break down, yet the underlying assumption of belonging remains intact. Dick Grayson can disagree with Batman without ceasing to be part of the family. Tim Drake can pursue his own path without losing his symbolic position. Their place inside the structure survives temporary failures because their legitimacy is treated as foundational rather than conditional. Stephanie never enjoys that luxury. Her legitimacy remains tied to performance in a way that fundamentally alters her psychological relationship with the role. Every action carries additional weight because every action appears connected to the question of whether she should have been there in the first place. A mistake becomes more than a mistake. It becomes potential evidence for an argument that has existed from the beginning. This creates a subtle but important shift in motivation. Heroes who feel secure often focus on the mission itself. Heroes who feel insecure are forced to divide their attention. Part of their energy goes toward solving external problems. Another part goes toward managing perceptions. The result is a constant state of pressure, not because the challenges are necessarily greater, but because failure threatens more than the immediate objective. Within Gotham's symbolic landscape, pressure functions like gravity. Some characters move through the city with the confidence of those who know the ground beneath them will hold. Others spend their lives compensating for instability. Stephanie belongs to the second category. Her story repeatedly places her in situations where competence alone cannot resolve the deeper conflict. The obstacle is not merely what she does. The obstacle is how her actions are interpreted. This dynamic becomes especially visible whenever comparisons emerge. Legacy systems are built upon comparison because inheritance itself requires predecessors. Every successor is measured against someone who came before. Yet the comparison surrounding Stephanie often feels fundamentally different. Dick Grayson and Tim Drake are treated as benchmarks. Stephanie is treated as a deviation from the benchmark. The distinction may appear small, but it changes the entire structure of evaluation. A benchmark establishes expectations. A deviation invites scrutiny. One position generates patience. The other generates skepticism. As a result, Stephanie often finds herself participating in a contest she never agreed to enter. She is not only being asked to succeed, She is being asked to justify why success should matter when it comes from her. This is where the psychological toll begins to deepen. Human beings construct stable identities through repeated confirmation. Over time, trust from others becomes internalized. It becomes part of how individuals understand themselves. When confirmation remains inconsistent, identity becomes more fragile. The person learns to anticipate reversal. Accomplishment no longer creates security, because security has repeatedly proven temporary. Stephanie's persistence, therefore, becomes more complicated than simple determination. Persistence is often romanticized as a virtue, but persistence under conditions of uncertainty carries costs. The individual must continually generate motivation without receiving equivalent reinforcement. Every step forward requires renewed effort. Every setback risks reopening old questions that were never fully resolved. The Robin mantle amplifies this burden because it is not merely a job. It is a public symbol. Symbols attract attention. Attention creates narratives. Narratives influence identity. Once Stephanie becomes Robin, her struggle ceases to exist solely within her own experience. It becomes part of the larger conversation surrounding what Robin represents. Suddenly, the debate is no longer confined to Gotham's fictional world. It extends into the audience itself. This is where institutional resistance begins to reveal its true power. Institutions rarely defend themselves through direct confrontation. More often, they defend themselves through expectations. They establish an image of normality and allow that image to police the boundaries of belonging. Anyone who fits the image moves comfortably through the system. Anyone who challenges it encounters friction that can be difficult to identify but impossible to ignore. Stephanie's presence inside the Robin role exposes that friction. The resistance she encounters often appears disproportionate to the events themselves because the conflict is never entirely about events. The conflict concerns the symbolic territory she now occupies. Her existence inside the mantle forces a reconsideration of assumptions that many people preferred to leave unexamined. The result is a strange inversion of the traditional heroic journey. In most stories, gaining the title marks the end of the struggle for recognition. The hero earns acceptance and moves forward into a new stage of responsibility. For Stephanie, gaining the title marks the beginning of a different battle. The conflict intensifies precisely because she has reached the position she was striving for. This creates an atmosphere of inevitability around her tenure as Robin. The role places her at the center of Gotham's symbolic stage, yet that visibility also magnifies every existing tension. Expectations become heavier. Scrutiny becomes sharper. The same spotlight that should validate her presence instead exposes the fragile foundations beneath it. What makes this development so significant is that it reveals a truth hidden inside many legacy systems. Inclusion and belonging are not identical concepts. Inclusion can be granted administratively. Belonging requires emotional and cultural acceptance. One can occur overnight. The other may never occur at all. Stephanie receives inclusion through the title. Belonging remains contested. The deeper she moves toward the center of Gotham's mythology, the more visible that contradiction becomes. Instead of dissolving old questions, her new position amplifies them. The symbol she hoped would provide stability becomes the arena where instability is constantly reenacted. Every attempt to secure her place encounters forces that seem determined to keep that place uncertain. And as this tension grows, the conflict begins to change shape. What started as a struggle between an individual and an institution gradually becomes something larger. The issue is no longer whether Stephanie Brown can become Robin. The issue is whether Gotham's legacy structure can tolerate a version of Robin that challenges its own assumptions about who was supposed to inherit the symbol in the first place. If the first stage of Stephanie Brown's conflict revolves around legitimacy, the second revolves around visibility. Once it becomes clear that earning the mantle will not automatically secure acceptance, a new problem emerges. The struggle is no longer confined to proving she belongs. The struggle becomes maintaining a coherent sense of self while occupying a role that constantly reflects uncertainty back at her. This is where her relationship with Tim Drake acquires a deeper symbolic weight. On the surface, Tim represents partnership, affection, and shared experience. Yet beneath those dynamics lies a more complicated reality. Tim embodies a version of Robin that Gotham understands instinctively. He occupies a position within the legacy that rarely requires explanation. His legitimacy feels natural to the structure around him because the structure itself helped shape it. Stephanie's position is fundamentally different. Every comparison between her and Tim quietly reinforces an imbalance that neither of them created. He becomes the standard against which she is measured, while she becomes the exception attempting to justify her presence. The relationship therefore exists inside a field of invisible pressures. Affection may be genuine, but symbolism does not disappear simply because people care about each other. This creates a particularly difficult psychological environment. Human beings naturally compare themselves to those closest to them. The process is almost unavoidable. Successes gain meaning through contrast. Failures gain meaning through contrast. Identity itself is often constructed through comparison. When one person occupies a secure position and the other occupies a contested one, those comparisons acquire tremendous emotional weight. For Stephanie, Tim becomes a living example of what acceptance looks like when it arrives without constant negotiation. He can leave the Robin mantle and remain an essential part of Gotham's mythology. His place within the structure survives transition. Stephanie repeatedly discovers that her own place appears far more dependent on circumstance. The result is not simple envy. It is something more unsettling. The realization that two people can make similar contributions while receiving very different forms of recognition. This tension becomes increasingly difficult to separate from self-worth. The danger of exclusion is not merely that it creates external obstacles. The danger is that external judgments eventually begin shaping internal narratives. Questions that originate outside the individual slowly migrate inward. What begins as uncertainty about belonging can become uncertainty about value itself. Stephanie's story repeatedly brushes against this territory. Not because she lacks confidence, but because confidence functions differently when operating under unstable conditions. Confidence grows through reinforcement. It strengthens when effort produces predictable recognition. When recognition remains inconsistent, confidence becomes harder to sustain. The individual begins spending energy defending their own perception of themselves. Within Gotham, this process is amplified by the nature of the Bat family itself. The group operates simultaneously as a family, an institution, and a symbolic hierarchy. These roles frequently overlap. Emotional relationships become entangled with questions of authority. Personal disagreements become intertwined with questions of legitimacy. Approval carries emotional significance because it also carries symbolic significance. Batman sits at the center of this structure. Whether intentionally or not, his judgments influence how every member understands their position. Approval from Batman is never merely personal. It functions as institutional validation. Disapproval carries equal power. As a result, every relationship within the Bat family exists beneath the shadow of a larger authority structure. For someone like Dick Grayson, this dynamic eventually becomes manageable because his place within the system is secure enough to survive conflict. For Stephanie, the situation is more complicated. When legitimacy already feels fragile, institutional approval becomes more psychologically important. Validation does not merely confirm performance. It confirms belonging. This helps explain why exclusion often leaves deeper marks than failure. Failure can be understood. It has identifiable causes. Exclusion is far more ambiguous. It creates uncertainty about whether the problem lies in actions, identity, or circumstances. The individual struggles to locate the source of rejection because the source itself often remains unclear. Stephanie repeatedly encounters this ambiguity. The barriers she faces rarely announce themselves openly. Instead, they emerge through patterns. Opportunities appear and disappear. Acceptance arrives and retreats. Progress is achieved and then destabilized. The resulting experience feels less like hitting a wall and more like walking across unstable ground. The psychological consequences of such an environment are profound. Stability allows individuals to direct energy outward toward goals and ambitions. Instability redirects attention inward. The person becomes preoccupied with maintaining equilibrium. Resources that could be devoted to growth become devoted to survival. Every step forward requires additional effort because the foundation beneath that step remains uncertain. This is why persistence becomes such a defining feature of Stephanie's character. Persistence is often interpreted as stubbornness or resilience, but in her case it functions as something more fundamental. It becomes an act of resistance against symbolic erasure. Every return challenges the assumption that exclusion should eventually produce withdrawal. Every reappearance rejects the expectation that uncertainty will ultimately drive her away. And that expectation is important. Legacy systems often rely on a quiet form of self-correction. Those who feel unwelcome eventually leave. Those who encounter enough resistance eventually stop pushing. The structure preserves itself because outsiders absorb the cost of adaptation. The institution changes very little because individuals are expected to change instead. Stephanie consistently refuses that logic. Rather than withdrawing, she remains present. Rather than accepting marginalization, she continues moving toward the center. Rather than allowing exclusion to define her relationship with heroism, she repeatedly reconstructs that relationship on her own terms. This does not eliminate the damage. It does not erase the doubts, but it prevents those forces from becoming final. The significance of this persistence extends beyond her individual story. Every institution develops assumptions about who naturally belongs within it. These assumptions often remain invisible until someone challenges them. Stephanie's presence forces Gotham's legacy structure to confront tensions it would otherwise prefer to ignore. Her continued existence inside the mythology becomes evidence that the boundaries surrounding the symbol are neither natural nor inevitable. This is where the conflict begins to evolve beyond personal experience. The question is no longer limited to Stephanie Brown's self-worth or her relationship with Tim Drake. The question becomes structural. What happens when an outsider refuses to remain outside? What happens when someone continues claiming space inside a system that repeatedly signals that the space was designed for someone else? The answer is rarely immediate. Institutions seldom transform overnight. Resistance often intensifies before change becomes possible. Old assumptions become more visible precisely because they are being challenged. The conflict grows sharper because the stakes have expanded beyond any single individual. And by this stage of Stephanie's story, that expansion has already begun. What started as a struggle for acceptance is gradually becoming a confrontation with the very foundations of Gotham's legacy itself. As Stephanie Brown's story progresses, the conflict reaches a point where legitimacy, recognition, and belonging can no longer be treated as separate issues. They begin collapsing into one another. The struggle is no longer about earning a place within Gotham's hierarchy. It is about surviving the psychological consequences of repeatedly having that place questioned. At this stage, the most important battle is not occurring in the streets of Gotham. It is occurring within the relationship between identity and validation. One of the most revealing aspects of Stephanie's history is how often she is forced to begin again. Heroes typically build momentum. Their victories accumulate into reputation, their reputation accumulates into authority, and their authority accumulates into permanence. Gotham rewards certain figures with narrative gravity. The longer they exist, the more difficult it becomes to imagine the city without them. They become part of its foundation. Stephanie experiences the opposite phenomenon. Again and again, she finds herself pulled back toward uncertainty. Progress does not always lead to consolidation. Recognition does not always become permanence. Achievements that would stabilize another character often become temporary footholds rather than lasting ground. The result is a life lived under conditions of symbolic instability. This instability gradually transforms the meaning of persistence itself. Early in her journey, persistence functions as ambition. She wants to prove herself. She wants recognition. She wants access to spaces that remain partially closed to her. Over time, however, persistence becomes something more defensive. It becomes a method of preserving identity against forces that continually threaten to redefine it from the outside. The distinction is important because people can survive failure more easily than they can survive invalidation. Failure challenges capability. Invalidation challenges existence. One asks whether a person succeeded. The other asks whether their contribution mattered at all. Stephanie repeatedly encounters situations where the second question becomes unavoidable. This is why the idea of the forgotten Robin carries such symbolic power. Forgetting is not merely the absence of memory. In cultural terms, forgetting functions as a form of exclusion. It determines whose stories become central and whose stories remain peripheral. It determines which figures are treated as foundations and which are treated as detours. To be forgotten inside a legacy is to occupy a strange position. One remains part of the history, while simultaneously existing outside the version of history most people remember. Stephanie's story continually circles this danger, not because she disappears entirely, but because her place within the narrative remains vulnerable to displacement. Other Robins become landmarks. Stephanie often risks becoming a footnote. The difference between those positions is not measured by achievement. It is measured by collective memory. Collective memory behaves much like Gotham itself. It creates centers and peripheries. Certain stories receive constant reinforcement, while others gradually fade from view. Over time, repetition becomes reality. The narratives that are remembered most frequently begin to define what people believe the legacy has always been. Alternative possibilities become harder to imagine simply because they are encountered less often. This process reveals one of the most uncomfortable truths hidden inside legacy structures. Institutions frequently present themselves as meritocratic while quietly operating through familiarity. What feels natural is often merely what has been repeated the longest. What feels inevitable is often what has received the most reinforcement. Stephanie's presence exposes this mechanism because her story constantly challenges assumptions that many people mistake for objective truths. The Robin mantle serves as a perfect example. On paper, Robin is a symbol of succession, a role designed to evolve through different individuals, a legacy built around transformation. Yet Stephanie's experience reveals how quickly a flexible symbol can become attached to rigid expectations. The mantle claims openness while preserving unwritten rules about who seems to belong inside it. As these tensions accumulate, her relationship with Gotham's larger mythology begins to change. She no longer functions merely as a participant within the system. She becomes evidence of the system's contradictions. Her story demonstrates that access and acceptance are not the same thing. It demonstrates that inclusion can coexist with exclusion. Most importantly, it demonstrates that institutions often reveal their true boundaries only after someone crosses them. This is where Stephanie becomes culturally significant in a way that extends beyond her original role. She starts to embody a conflict that exists far outside superhero fiction. The conflict between formal opportunity and genuine belonging. The conflict between symbolic inclusion and emotional acceptance. The conflict between entering a room and being treated as though the room was built with you in mind. Many characters represent achievement. Stephanie increasingly represents endurance. Not endurance in the physical sense. Gotham is filled with characters capable of surviving impossible injuries, impossible losses, and impossible battles. Stephanie's endurance operates on a different level. It is the endurance required to continue participating in a system that repeatedly places conditions upon recognition. The endurance required to maintain self-definition while external narratives attempt to narrow it. This transforms her into something unusual within the Bat family. Most members are remembered for what they inherited or what they became. Stephanie becomes memorable because of what she refused to surrender. She refuses to surrender visibility. She refuses to surrender legitimacy. Most importantly, she refuses to surrender ownership over her own story. That refusal carries consequences for the mythology itself. Every time Stephanie returns, she disrupts the idea that exclusion can permanently determine value. Every time she reclaims space, she challenges assumptions about who gets to define the legacy. Her persistence becomes a form of pressure applied directly against Gotham's symbolic architecture. And pressure changes structures. Not immediately, not cleanly, but inevitably. The more Stephanie remains present, the more difficult it becomes to treat her as an exception. The more difficult it becomes to dismiss her contribution as temporary. The more difficult it becomes to preserve older definitions of the Robin Mantle without acknowledging the contradictions they contain. Her continued existence inside the mythology forces Gotham to confront questions it cannot easily answer. By this point, the conflict has evolved far beyond the circumstances that originally created it. What began as a struggle for legitimacy has become a struggle over memory itself. Over who is remembered, who is centered, who is treated as foundational, who is allowed to become part of the story people tell when they explain what a legacy means. And in confronting those questions, Stephanie Brown ultimately reveals something larger than her own experience. She reveals that the greatest challenge facing many institutions is not deciding who may enter. The greatest challenge is deciding whether they are willing to change after someone enters who was never expected to be there in the first place. The reason Stephanie Brown's story continues to generate discussion is not simply because of what happened to her. Gotham is full of characters who have suffered greater losses, endured greater tragedies, and experienced greater transformations. What distinguishes Stephanie is that her conflict touches something structural within the mythology itself. Her story forces attention toward the mechanisms through which legacies decide who belongs at their center and who remains at their edges. Most superhero universes present themselves as systems of constant evolution. New heroes emerge, old heroes retire, and symbols pass from one generation to the next. On the surface, these worlds celebrate change. Yet beneath that appearance exists a competing force. Every legacy also depends on continuity. Every institution develops an image of itself that it becomes reluctant to alter. The result is a constant tension between adaptation and preservation. Stephanie Brown occupies the exact point where those forces collide. Her presence exposes the gap between what the Robin Mantle claims to be and what it often functions as in practice. If Robin is truly a symbol of succession, then succession should be capable of producing unexpected outcomes. If the mantle can only feel legitimate when occupied by certain kinds of successors, then its flexibility may be far more limited than it initially appears. This is why debates surrounding Stephanie rarely remain confined to her individual character. Conversations about her quickly become conversations about the meaning of Robin itself. They become conversations about legitimacy, inheritance, and access. The character acts as a lens through which larger assumptions suddenly become visible. People are no longer arguing only about Stephanie Brown. They are arguing about the boundaries of the institution she entered. Culturally, this gives her story an unusual degree of symbolic power. Many fictional conflicts operate at the level of narrative events. Readers debate decisions, outcomes, and character arcs. Stephanie's story repeatedly moves beyond those questions because the tension surrounding her reflects real social dynamics that exist far outside Gotham. Questions about belonging, recognition, and legitimacy are not unique to superhero fiction. They appear wherever institutions distribute status and authority. One of the most fascinating aspects of symbolic exclusion is that it rarely presents itself as exclusion. Institutions generally prefer narratives of openness. They describe themselves as accessible, fair, and welcoming. The contradiction emerges when someone enters the space and discovers that acceptance remains governed by unwritten expectations. Official barriers may disappear while cultural barriers remain intact. Participation becomes possible without ever becoming fully comfortable. Stephanie's experience mirrors this process with remarkable precision. She is not locked outside the gates. She enters. She participates. She succeeds. Yet uncertainty continues to surround her position. The result is a form of tension that feels strangely familiar because it echoes experiences that exist in schools, workplaces, communities, and countless other social structures. People often discover that access and belonging are not synonymous. This dynamic helps explain why so many readers identify with her despite the highly fictional context surrounding her story. Gotham may be filled with masked vigilantes and theatrical villains, but the emotional architecture beneath the narrative remains recognizable. Many people know what it feels like to enter a space where acceptance appears conditional. Many people understand the experience of working harder than others while receiving less certainty in return. Stephanie becomes a symbolic expression of that reality. At the same time, her story reveals how communities construct collective memory. Memory is not neutral. Every fandom, institution, and culture decides which stories deserve emphasis. Some figures become central reference points. Others drift toward the margins. Over time, repetition creates hierarchy. The stories told most frequently begin to define the official version of history. Stephanie occupies an unstable position within this process. She cannot be completely erased because her contribution to the mythology is too significant. Yet she is also not always granted the same centrality afforded to other Robins. This creates a fascinating tension. She remains part of the legacy, while simultaneously illustrating how selective that legacy's memory can be. The phenomenon extends beyond comic books. Every culture creates symbolic centers. Certain narratives become foundational because they reinforce the image a community prefers to have of itself. Stories that introduce complications, contradictions, or uncomfortable questions often receive less attention. They survive, but they occupy less visible territory. Their existence challenges the simplicity of the dominant narrative. Stephanie's story consistently performs that function. She complicates the mythology. She introduces friction into a legacy that often prefers clarity. Her existence raises questions that do not possess easy answers. If Robin is about potential, why is certain potential embraced more readily than others? If the Mantle is about growth, why do some successors receive greater patience during that growth? If legitimacy is earned, why does legitimacy sometimes appear unevenly distributed? These questions transform the Robin mantle from a costume into a cultural arena. The symbol becomes contested territory. Different interpretations compete for authority. Different visions of the legacy struggle to establish themselves. Stephanie's presence ensures that these tensions remain visible rather than disappearing beneath the weight of tradition. The relationship between Stephanie and Tim Drake further amplifies this symbolic dimension. Together, they embody two radically different experiences of institutional acceptance. Tim represents integration. Stephanie represents negotiation. Tim's journey largely reinforces the structure. Stephanie's journey exposes its inconsistencies. Their relationship therefore operates as more than a personal story. It becomes a reflection of how systems distribute certainty and uncertainty among those who occupy similar positions. This contrast helps explain why their dynamic continues to resonate years after many specific plot details have faded from memory. Readers intuitively recognize the imbalance even when they cannot immediately articulate it. One character moves through the legacy with relative stability. The other continually struggles to secure the same stability despite comparable commitment. The difference creates tension because it feels fundamentally unresolved. Perhaps most importantly, Stephanie Brown reveals how persistence itself can become culturally meaningful. Popular mythology often celebrates triumph. Stories tend to focus on those who conquer obstacles and secure recognition. Persistence receives less attention because persistence implies that recognition remains incomplete. It suggests that the struggle has not ended. Stephanie's narrative refuses the comfort of final validation. Again and again, she is forced to reassert her place. Again and again, she returns to conversations that appear settled only to discover they were never settled at all. Rather than weakening her symbolic significance, this repetition strengthens it. Her persistence becomes inseparable from her identity. As a result, she occupies a unique position within modern superhero mythology. She is not merely a successor. She is not merely a sidekick. She becomes a symbol of what happens when individuals continue demanding space within systems that repeatedly attempt to define the limits of their participation. Her story transforms persistence from a personal trait into a cultural statement. And that transformation ultimately explains why Stephanie Brown remains relevant. The details of continuity may shift. Editorial priorities may change. Different eras may reinterpret her role. Yet the underlying conflict continues to resonate because it addresses a tension that extends far beyond Gotham. The tension between being allowed into a space and being accepted within it. The tension between inheritance and belonging. The tension between occupying a symbol and being recognized as one of its rightful heirs. Those tensions are larger than any individual character. Stephanie Brown simply happens to make them impossible to ignore. Most legacy stories end with acceptance. The successor proves worthy, inherits the symbol, and secures a place within the larger mythology. The conflict resolves because legitimacy is finally achieved. Stephanie Brown's story refuses that structure. What makes her journey memorable is not that she ultimately earned recognition, but that recognition never arrived in a stable, uncontested form. The struggle remained active long after the supposed destination had been reached. This creates a very different kind of legacy. Stephanie is not remembered primarily as the Robin who transformed the Mantle. She is remembered as the Robin who exposed tensions that already existed within it. Her story acts less like a victory narrative and more like a stress test. By occupying the role, she revealed assumptions that had remained invisible while the system operated under familiar conditions. In this sense, her importance extends beyond the events of her own character arc. She becomes significant because of what her presence forces the mythology to confront. Every legacy develops an image of itself. Every institution creates stories about fairness, succession, and belonging. These stories help maintain internal stability. They create the impression that advancement follows understandable rules. Stephanie's experience complicates that narrative by revealing how much legitimacy depends not only on achievement, but also on perception. The consequence is that her story continues operating even when individual storylines end. Readers may disagree about specific creative decisions, but the underlying questions remain active. Why are some successors embraced more quickly than others? Why do certain figures become permanent fixtures while others must repeatedly justify their existence? What determines who becomes central to a legacy and who remains vulnerable to exclusion despite sharing the same symbolic space? These questions prevent Stephanie from becoming merely a historical footnote. Footnotes explain the past. Stephanie continues to interrogate the present. Every discussion about Robin inevitably circles issues that her story brought into focus. Questions of inheritance, questions of legitimacy, questions of who gets to define the boundaries of belonging. The Mantle cannot fully escape those questions because her presence permanently attached them to it. Her relationship with Tim Drake remains part of that legacy as well. Not because it was simply a romance, but because it embodied two different experiences of recognition existing side by side. Tim represented the stability that institutions grant to those they comfortably recognize. Stephanie represented the uncertainty faced by those who must continually negotiate their position. Together, they illustrated how belonging is distributed unevenly even within the same symbolic family. What makes this dynamic so enduring is that neither character functions as a villain in the equation. There is no single person responsible for the imbalance. The tension emerges from the structure itself. The legacy operates according to assumptions that long predate either character. Stephanie's struggle therefore reveals how systems can produce exclusion without requiring deliberate malice. The architecture itself generates pressure. This is why her persistence becomes the defining image that remains after everything else fades. Many heroes are remembered for singular moments. A victory, a sacrifice, a transformation. Stephanie is remembered for continuity of effort. She remains present. She returns. She rebuilds. Again and again, she refuses the invitation to disappear. The act of remaining becomes central to her mythology. Over time, that persistence transforms into a form of symbolic authority. Not the authority granted by institutions, but the authority earned through endurance. Gotham repeatedly pushes her toward the margins, yet she repeatedly reclaims space within the narrative. The very act of surviving exclusion becomes part of what gives her significance. She acquires a legitimacy that exists independently of formal recognition. There is an irony embedded within this outcome. The character who spent so much of her history fighting for acceptance ultimately becomes valuable because of the struggle itself. The conflicts that once appeared to diminish her importance become the source of her distinctiveness. Without them, she would simply be another successor in a long line of successors. Because of them, she becomes something far more revealing. Stephanie Brown ultimately stands as a reminder that legacies are not defined solely by those they celebrate. They are also defined by those they struggle to accommodate. Every institution reveals itself most clearly when confronted by someone who does not fit comfortably within its expectations. Those moments expose the difference between what a system claims to be and what it actually is. That is why the story of Stephanie Brown remains unresolved in the most meaningful sense. The conflict never truly ends because the questions she raises continue to exist. Every generation inherits symbols. Every generation decides who belongs within them. Every generation confronts the tension between preserving tradition and expanding it. Stephanie's story endures because it lives precisely at that intersection. The forgotten Robin was never truly forgotten. She became the memory that the legacy cannot fully escape. And in many ways, that is a far more permanent form of inheritance than the mantle itself.